I err on the side of optimism that people aren't always just unnecessarily cruel, but maybe really just don't know much about grief at all and haven't gone through it. And so they think that there is a, very rigid timeline and that this person should have moved on with their lives by now. And I think that those responses are unfortunately all too common, especially like you said, with the idea of asking like, are you okay? Or, oh, I didn't know that this was so hard for you. It can be really scary to feel seen like that. It really is brave to share in that way. And I think something that people can also kind of hold on to as motivation, as long as it feels good for them and they don't feel like they're stretching themselves too much or sharing things that they don't want to be sharing, knowing that you probably are kind of illuminating the path for other people who are either grieving right now, who are going to grieve at some point.
Welcome to Big Energy. I'm your host, Cassie Underwood, here to give you a dose of that good energy and talk with people who do it best. Each week, I bring you the knowledge we need to be the forces of nature we came here to be. I am super stoked to share this conversation with you today because we are diving deep on something that every person on planet Earth has experienced or will experience in their lifetime. We are talking about grief with the one and only Alex Mammadyarov. Alex is the founder and creator of Grief Uncovered on Instagram. She is a Columbia-educated therapist who advocates for living authentically with loss and grief. I explored the impact of living in a grief-negative culture in my book, May Cause Love, and grief has continued to be one of the topics in the book that readers of every background resonated with most. I even offer to all of my clients, no matter what they've been through, a 30-second grief practice. And I believe that Alex's work, and I say this as a grief activist, as someone who's been really interested in grief for a long time, I believe Alex's work is absolutely next level. It's the cutting edge of grief work. It's what we've all wanted and needed around grief. Grief Uncovered is a really incredible resource and experience for everyone because it's creating a community of people who are challenging outdated models of grief and these sort of fake and unhelpful conversations we find ourselves in after a loss or when we're talking to someone who's going through it. And it offers a fresh and real way forward as we live with loss. Alex and I talk about grief around COVID, the unhelpful things people say to people experiencing grief, what to say to authentically offer your support, how to not take care of other people's emotions when you're dealing with your own loss, and how to build a space so that you can grieve freely. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the show, Alex. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I wanted to bring you on here, first of all, because I'm a huge fan of Grief Uncovered on Instagram. I follow it religiously. A lot of people I know follow it. It's been so cool to see you create this. I knew of you because I'm a good friend of your sister's, but I also got to see people I know from all areas of life become fans of you and start following you and really find your work resonant. So I could not wait to bring you on here. And I feel like the grief topic, at least for me, it's really personal to me. It's really personal to a lot of people. So I wrote a book about abortion, and the topic of grief was the thing that so many people, it did not matter if they'd had an abortion or ever thought a day about abortion. Once I was talking about grief, they were all about it. It's just something that is really resonant with people. But then I also thought about this pandemic that has been going on for the past, almost a year and a half in the United States. Everyone's life has changed dramatically. And everyone has experienced significant loss, and that brings up significant grief, even if they haven't lost somebody to COVID.
Thank you for that intro. I think that grief has never been more a part of our collective consciousness than right now. And being somebody who was already writing about grief well before the pandemic, it can feel a little bit like, oh, I wonder how much this will continue. Like how much as we start stepping back into some semblance of a normal life, are we actually going to keep talking about grief, or is interest in that topic kind of going to wane? That makes me feel especially worried for people who did experience a COVID death or another death during the pandemic that wasn't to COVID. I don't want their stories and their experiences to be kind of forgotten as we're going back to normal.
I think that's so important. You wrote a post about how hard it must be for people who have experienced a COVID death to see anti-maskers speaking out. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. In grief, I think that people tend to seek out groups of people who will resonate with their experience. So you'll often find that there are like very specific grief groups out there, like grief for siblings or partners or children. And I imagine that there will be many groups for COVID grief specifically. I think that we tend to say when people enter grief, like, welcome to the club, you're kind of in the grief club now. I think they will have their own sort of club because it's such a unique experience to have gone through loss in this time. And I think that something, unfortunately, that must have made it unique was seeing there be such controversy and seeing people argue on TV and seeing it being very politicized, something that your loved one actually died from. And I had written something some time back, just reflecting on that for so many of us, maybe who've lost a loved one to a different illness, we would never turn on the TV and see people arguing about whether or not a type of cancer is real or how serious it is. But that's something that unfortunately was really unique with COVID.
Totally. How do you define grief?
I think that grief is a vast collection of feelings. I don't think it's one singular feeling. And I think that it's something that is just continually changing and ebbing and flowing over time. Of course, we think of immense sadness, but I think there's also really powerful transformation that happens in grief. It's not only emotional symptoms, but also somatic symptoms. It's just a complete rebirth.
Yeah, totally. I think rebirth, that's a really good word for it. How did you become interested in this?
I have my own personal experience with grief. I lost both of my parents to cancer by the time that I was 15. So the concepts of death and loss and grief are so normalized to me. And I think as I got older, I started realizing that that's not the case for everyone. And it's actually something that most people would avoid ever talking about. So yeah, a couple of years ago, I think just from being connected to smaller networks of people who've experienced parent loss, I knew that there was a need for just more conversation. And I think conversation in a way that kind of sidesteps outdated frameworks and the cliches that aren't really that helpful. Once I started kind of putting some messages out there, I noticed it was just very welcomed by people who were feeling really alone in their experience. And that was sort of my goal, is to meet those people and give them something to resonate with.
That's so cool. And I totally agree. And when I think about it, it's like, there are times when, you go through a loss, you're so present to grief in your life, right? But we live in a grief negative culture that teaches us to suppress our grief. Mm-hmm. So then we can really do a good job of pushing it down, even a fairly significant loss, for a long time, maybe forever. It's continuing to reinscribe this culture in which people aren't grieving or not allowing themselves to go through the entire process, which I learned is a great gift, to go all the way through the experience and to kind of birth, as you're saying, whatever there is to be birthed from a loss. I mean, I define grief a little bit more broadly as also including a change or a choice, because those involve loss. If somebody has experienced loss, how might they know that they're experiencing grief?
I think the first thing is just feeling like something is fundamentally off, like something is missing, obviously the person. But I think there's so many ways, maybe feeling like you can't sit with any memories about somebody that you've lost, or whatever it was that you lost, whether that be a past version of yourself, a former place that you lived, a community you used to be a part of, I think if you can't be present to any memory of that, that would be kind of a good clue that something's amiss there.
Wow, that's a really good one. So like if you've been through something, if you've been through a loss of some sort and you're finding it hard to actually just sit with thinking about it, then yeah, there's the suppression that's happening. Is that like a sign of being like in denial around grief? Not to use the Kubler-Ross model, because as you were saying on I'm learning so much from your account. I was already really into grief, but once I got to your account, I was like, yeah. So the Kubler-Ross model is for people who are dying.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So can you talk about that for a second?
I think that that's the most common framework that people hear about in loss, the 5 stages of grief. I think that it's often recommended to people like, oh, you should read that book or you should Google that. Maybe that's what you're experiencing. And it's not to say that people don't ever experience those feelings, but the idea of moving through grief in these very neat linear stages seems to be really off for most people. You just can't predict it like any human emotion.
I think we want to know what's going to happen though, right? So it's kind of comforting to be like, and then I'm going to go through depression and then I'm going to be angry for a little bit. But it's like, that wasn't even for people who are actually experiencing the loss.
Yeah, she created that model from working with terminally ill people, and it makes a lot more sense, especially with the bargaining aspect of it. Most people who are grieving are like, what am I bargaining? I don't know how do I do that? I also completely agree. I try to be flexible both in my clinical work with people who are grieving and in my writing, that you don't have to abide by a framework, but also if you like a framework and it actually is helpful for you, even if it's just taking bits and pieces, that's great too, because I can understand how it would be really scary to feel like there's no guide at all.
Yeah, that's a good point. So like you can take a model, but you don't have to, and there's nothing wrong with you if it doesn't apply.
Yeah.
Totally. I remember going through different forms of grief in my life, and I did like to think, I love a formula. I'm just the kind of person I am. I love a recipe. Like if you do these things, you're going to get this result. I'd like to be done with the grief now. So I'm going to go through these stages. But yeah, I mean, it's true that they don't always apply. What are the things that somebody who's in grief might be feeling?
I think it does depend on at what point they are in their process. If it's very early grief, I think they might just feel really depleted and kind of like going through the motions, sort of like on autopilot, energy way down. Later on, I think there's other ways that grief can manifest even when you're sort of going back to daily life where you're able to fully engage with the world again. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you might feel like a totally different person, and it might feel like there is a mismatch between who you are internally and this life that you've been living in this world. It just looks completely different, and trying to negotiate that and navigate that. Like, what are my relationships with other people now? What is my purpose in life? We can get really existential later on in grief.
Yeah, that's so true. Like, I feel like the grieving is a process, at least for me, of integration, integrating everything that's happened with my actual reality.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And each time I've gone through something, it's definitely created a massive shift in my life. Each time there's been mainly a loss of somebody or a big change, there's a massive shift where I'm going to have to reassess everything in my life. What kind of experiences have you seen others go through in your clinical practice, in your study, in your work that have been pretty powerful in terms of renegotiating life for themselves?
Something that I have seen is people, exploring their identity and who they are now, especially without somebody that used to be a big part of how they identified in the world, especially if it was somebody that you really feel like understood you and that is no longer here. And how do you kind of give yourself what they gave you? But I think that I've seen it shift people's sort of like increasing clarity around values and what's important to them, what really matters. And I think that's really powerful. And in a way, I'm always hesitant to say that it's not necessarily like a silver lining, or it's not as though people wouldn't trade anything back just to have that person or whatever it is that they're grieving. They would often rather have back than have just learned some incredible lesson. But it still is so powerful and special when people notice that about themselves, that they have had this major shift in values.
If somebody's going through that, do you have tools that you like to give them?
Because I love writing and I've seen how much writing can be impactful for people who are grieving. I think journaling is just the best, most basic place to start, is start writing out how you're feeling and really free flowing without any kind of prompts or anything like that.
Do you have a certain time period that you like to write for, or is it just like go for it?
I think just go for it, and for however short or long, because I think when you start binding yourself to some kind of timed thing, that it can actually kind of disrupt the flow a little bit.
That's so true. You did a post recently. It was a partnership between you and another group about the difference between grief and depression.
Yeah. So that post was with an account called I Go to Therapy, which is super helpful. I really love that account. But yeah, so the post is essentially a Venn diagram looking at grief and depression. They can be really confusing to parse out and separate, especially because they could technically overlap, or you could be going through a loss and then enter a depressive episode. But there are some key things that I think are different also. So the things that are similar, it's kind of like going back to what I had said before about early grief, where in the beginning, you might really feel so energetically depleted. You could also have sleep disturbances, changes in appetite, things like that, just lowered mood. But then in terms of differences with grief, you probably won't have a decrease in self-esteem. You probably won't have as much hopelessness that's related to negative feelings about yourself. And with depression, that's more likely the case. With grief, thinking about dying can be much more existential and much more about what does my life mean? What will my death be like? Taking kind of a new interest in exploring what end of life is like. Whereas thoughts about death and depression might be more linked to something like suicidal ideation. So it's really important to really be able to see the difference. And I think what we wanted to highlight there was that going to therapy, if people are open to that, can be really helpful. Having a sounding board to put that all out there and sort of go through it all.
Yeah, definitely. You don't want to mistake those two, right? Like you really want to know the difference if you're going through grief versus depression. And then, it's possible people are going through both of them at the same time, which is obviously really complicated. I remember when I was writing my book, it really astonished me and kind of like ticked me off that the DSM manual would diagnose forms of grief. Like grief lasting longer than 6 months was considered complex grief. And I understand from an insurance perspective that some of that might have been just to get the insurance companies to pay for somebody to go to therapy for grief. When we pathologize something or put it in a medical model when it's a human experience, there's a really big fucking problem there, because then it stigmatizes it. Like the medical model has done a lot for stigmatizing human experiences. I consider even depression to be a human experience. I go through periods of depression in my life. I mean, in the beginning, it was scary, but now I'm like, oh, this has a message for me. What's the message, right? So when something like grief is put into that model, and it's like, of course, somebody's going to grieve. And if they've just lost a spouse or just lost a parent, of course, it's going to last longer than 6 months. Some people don't even start to experience grief at all until like a year or two after something's happened. So what do you think about all this?
I think that something like prolonged grief disorder or complicated bereavement, I think that those things are sort of considered controversial for the very reasons that you were saying. And I think something to know is that different mental health practitioners have different stances on diagnosis, period. So there are people who really like to look at diagnosis, mainly just so that you feel like you're able to follow a treatment plan that has efficacy behind it. Like there's research that says that this is effective. Mm-hmm. That's what the benefit of the label is. And then there are people who feel like it's just a necessary evil. It's kind of something we have to do for insurance, like you were saying. And, I do wonder how much of that plays a role in the development of that as a diagnosis, that people need to be able to pay for therapy, and whatever makes that doable is important. But yeah, I think, again, it's hard to, just like it's difficult to sort of bind yourself to a model of grief. Kind of the same thing. You're putting time limits on it that I don't think are necessarily helpful. I think that can actually even be harmful. So I definitely think people should advocate for themselves and sort of ask even a potential therapist what their stance is on that. as they're beginning to work together. And keeping in mind, like you were saying, that for some people, grieving might not even start for a while. I always say that grief can become delayed while we're busy surviving. Sometimes we just don't even have the capacity to slow down and actually experience it.
That's so true. And then sometimes it can be a vicious cycle where we're not grieving because we're scared and we're busy and we're busy not grieving. There's a lot going on there. What are some warning signs of like not the kind of therapist that you want to go to for grief?
Somebody who says that they've never worked with grief before, maybe is not the, it's certainly, you can see somebody who's a generalist and kind of sees everybody. But I think, having somebody that's interested in working with grief is probably a great place to start. And within that, I think probably a red flag could be somebody who does say that, sort of gives an indication that they think you should be over this. I think even just language like that, like moving on, which is a thing that people say pretty often, that I think can feel really harsh in grief. The idea of moving on or moving like away from that person that you've lost, instead of moving forward with this experience, moving forward with the grief, which is very possible. So I think noticing that language and what the expectations are that that person might have about how long grief lasts.
Ooh, yeah. If they have expectations at all, would you consider that an issue?
I think it's tricky because to some degree, if someone is in grief and it's actually so debilitating that they're not able to function in their daily lives for an extended period of time, that's a problem, right? And that probably does need some more serious intervention. And that's also where it would be good to look at, is there a depressive disorder going on? Mm-hmm. So I think that it's difficult to give a clear answer.
If you're a bad bitch who's ready to create a massive shift into abundance and ease around money, I've got good news for you. I officially reopened the doors to my popular program, Money Metaphysics for Maverick Women. It's a 6-month group program where you receive direct guidance from me, live calls, instant access to my 13-module course, Big Money Energy, plus a 2-day in-person retreat and tons of other live support and content. Learn more about the program at cassieunderwood.com/MMMW. Check it all out now and register at cassieunderwood.com/MMMW. I always have my ear to the ground when someone's intolerant of others grieving. I feel like I'm like a grief activist in some way. Like I really feel like people should be allowed to grieve however they need to for however long they need. And I've also heard of people saying that this person's been kind of not engaging with life for 3 or 4 years following the loss and that sort of thing. What are the signs of somebody not living their life or who have kind of shut down in grief? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think what you just said about somebody who seems like they're not engaging in their own life, really isolating from other people, which I do think is pretty normal in early grief. But if that really goes on, I mean, we're social creatures, and at some point, community is important. And even just one-on-one connections are really important. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that can happen. I think people, if they seek support in grief and they receive support that maybe is well-intentioned but really misses the mark, can make you feel very alone and like there's not much point in seeking more help. And when that goes on and continues for a really extended time, that is a time when it would be really important to have extra support in whatever capacity feels right for you, whether that's going to a therapist, whether that is just having one close friend that you can talk to or finding a bereavement group.
Definitely. So when we're going through grief ourselves, other than getting a therapist, what would be other ways we can support ourselves? Like what are things that we can say to ourselves or just any way that we can support ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's such a buzzword, but self-care is just, I don't think there's a time where it's ever more essential or crucial.
Okay, what kinds of self-care would you recommend for someone who's going through grief?
I think one thing that's really helpful is moving your body, especially because our natural inclination in grief might be to not do that at all. But something that's really gentle, like really gentle movement, like yoga or dancing in your home. Reflection is also a big part of self-care and grief. Like I had mentioned, journaling before, as long as it's in a way that's really free-flowing and not like you're holding yourself to any kind of rigid guidelines. Meditation is absolutely really powerful. I think that can also be pretty cathartic too. I think that can really bring up a lot and really help release a lot. And I think there's also a balance of spending time in community with other people and spending reflective time in solitude and making sure that it's not going to the point of, oh, I'm just like spending time on my own for self-care, but it's actually becoming really isolating, and knowing when to move back into community.
Yeah, I think that's why it's so important to have people around you who are seeing you, like therapists, really close friends who are brave enough to say, it's time to go outside now. I think that's really, really important, because when you're in it, it's really hard to see if you've been inside for like, a week or something like that. It can start to feel really normalized, especially during the pandemic. I mean, things are opening up now, but I think it's super, super important.
I think really reminding yourself that there does not have to be a rigid timeline for you, and really just to allow whatever needs to come up, but also keeping in mind that you don't need to constantly engage in the emotional labor of processing your grief. It's okay to kind of put it on the back burner sometimes so that you feel like you can just get out there and live. And maybe you'll find that you kind of like return to it over time again and again when you feel ready. But I definitely think any form of community, no matter how big or small, is really key.
Do you have ways that people should deal with the guilt that might come up if they're wanting to put it on the back burner, and maybe they've lost somebody really important to them and they want to go out to a dinner party, but they feel bad about, should I do this? What will other people think if I'm out there? Am I supposed to honor a certain period of time? How does somebody deal with all of those thoughts and emotions that come up?
Yeah, I think definitely breaking down what is the worry there. Is it a worry about genuinely feeling like you're doing something wrong? Who are you disappointing here? Do you feel like you're disappointing yourself? Are you disappointing the person who died, disappointing other people? I think if that's your inclination, is to go out to a dinner party and that's what feels good for you, you should absolutely go for that. I always say that I think the best way that we can honor people that we've lost is to honor ourselves. I think that is most likely what they would want for us. That might be a little bit trickier if we had a complicated relationship with them. But yeah, I think that the more that we normalize that grief has so many different faces, the less that there will be such rigid expectations on people. And if somebody does go to a dinner party right after a loss, it won't really be frowned upon or looked at in a strange way.
Yeah, if we're in the energy of owning, like, this is what's best for me, and I feel good about this, then there's not going to be that energy of like judgment. Yeah. Personally, I'm all about full self-expression and authenticity around everything. And I think for me, a huge part of the reason that matters and has been a huge part of my journey is because when I had an abortion when I was 19, and I felt that culture was telling me I wasn't allowed to grieve because A, it would imply that I actually had something to grieve, and that wasn't something a pro-choice feminist should imply. B, it was a loss that I chose, and since it was my choice, I should be happy about it. And C, as a culture, we're generally uncomfortable with grief, sex, death, women's empowerment, and grieving around abortion was a reminder of all four of those, right? So I had to really learn how to express myself, even if other people didn't get it or felt uncomfortable and tried to shut it down or intellectualize it or whatever. So how do you suggest that people build the internal fortitude to be authentic? You've written a lot about this, being authentic around grief, to be authentic and express, especially when they feel emotionally vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that it's really challenging, and it's really a unique path to figure out what that looks like for you. For some people, that will be very open with people in your life, or even having a social media platform on that subject. I mean, the grief online space has just exploded in the last couple of years, and there are so many people sharing these really powerful posts that are sort of like open diary entries. For somebody else, that might not be the way to be most authentic. What might be most authentic for them is to keep it more private, or have it be something that's really sacred between them and maybe one or just a few other people. But I really think it is about leaning into what is working for you and what's not working for you, because at the end of the day, nobody else is experiencing your grief, so nobody else has to go through what you go through and cope the way that you cope. It's so individual.
Let's say that for someone, sharing about their experience is really important, talking about the experience, and also having people. I think for some people, this is not my clinical practice, but I'm a spiritual teacher. So I work with people around grief quite often. And I think that sharing about it helps in the integration process of like, here's my new identity. So I need to share with you this journey that I've been on and this journey that I'm going through. And doing that can be really brave for some people. And it can also elicit those like, you're just looking for attention kind of comments. And they can be very subtle. They can be like, are you okay? Like they can be very condescending, whatever it is. How should people deal with those kinds of comments?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is to remember that it probably has a lot less to do with you than it has to do with them. Their own reactions, their own wounds, their own ideas. I err on the side of optimism that people aren't always just unnecessarily cruel, but maybe really just don't know much about grief at all and haven't gone through it. And so they think that there is a, very rigid timeline and that this person should have moved on with their lives by now. And I think that those responses are unfortunately all too common, especially like you said, with the idea of asking like, are you okay? Or, oh, I didn't know that this was so hard for you. It can be really scary to feel seen like that. It really is brave to share in that way. And I think something that people can also kind of hold on to as motivation, as long as it feels good for them and they don't feel like they're stretching themselves too much or sharing things they don't want to be sharing, knowing that you probably are kind of illuminating the path for other people who are either grieving right now, who are going to grieve at some point. And they will know that maybe you're somebody that they could go to. Even just reading about your experiences can be helpful for them. It's sort of like paying it forward. I think it just kind of continues on and on, that people begin to share more and more and it becomes more normalized.
Yeah, that is so resonant. Yeah. And I'm realizing that as we're talking, that going through grief requires creating a safe space around yourself to go through it. Mm-hmm. And part of that is letting go of the fear of what other people think and deciding what's best for you. Like you said, going to the party anyway. And then also you had this amazing post about when as a griever, we feel the need to rescue someone else from feeling awkward around us because we have emotions. Mm-hmm. And that is also such a good boundary. In order to grieve, you actually have to create a space where you let other people feel the way that they need to feel. You let other people judge. You don't give a shit what other people think and just go through your thing without needing to people please. It's like you have to break through from codependency in order to grieve. So
I love talking about this. Yeah. So I think that this is something that comes up a lot for people, where you just find yourself in a scenario where you have to mention the loss. For whatever reason, it comes up in the conversation, you can't really avoid it. And we deliver that information in such a delicate way because I think we're really worried about how the other person is going to respond. And I think part of it is worrying that they'll feel uncomfortable. And part of it probably also is wondering if their reaction will upset us. So we kind of try to just sidestep that by delivering it in a really gentle way or kind of minimizing it. Or even if somebody says that they're sorry for your loss, saying something like, it's okay. Just stopping and rewinding a little bit and asking yourself if it's really okay. Of course, we live in a culture where we're conditioned to just say that we're okay all the time. That's almost like a rhetorical question. So the more that we trust that people will be okay, they can handle hearing about it if we can handle living with it, everybody's better off. And you're actually, not only are you being more authentic for yourself, you're letting the other person be more authentic too and just react how they're going to react.
So instead of saying it's okay, what can people say?
People have very different feelings about this. I've heard some people say, I'm sorry too, or just thank you, or yeah, it was really hard, or it's still really hard. Whatever feels like it's totally true for you in that moment, and also doesn't feel like it's too much of a share, depending on what your relationship is with that person and what you're comfortable with.
Yeah, I love that. So not needing to take care of the other person's emotions when you're mentioning the loss, not trying to say, it's okay that this terrible thing happened, and then owning it in an authentic way, just authentically responding to them, and then trusting that they can handle themselves.
Yeah.
But I also really get what you just said about the fear that they're going to respond in a way that will be upsetting, especially if we haven't done a lot of processing. You can just feel like a raw nerve around it. Can feel defensive and all kinds of emotions. I know for me, at least, I wouldn't want to get angry or something if I'm like at some event and somebody says something that doesn't land well with me. So I can see that being part of it. I'm trying to not get my own emotions elicited. So what are some things that people say that are not the right things to say, or that really just don't land?
The first thing that comes to mind for me is the idea of grief platitudes. A platitude is just a phrase that's said so much that it loses all meaning, becomes totally hollow, even if it on the surface sounds nice. This especially comes up, I think, with spiritual bypassing. They kind of overlap where, people will say things like, that was the plan for your life, or everything happens for a reason, sort of like telling somebody that this was meant to be for them, saying things like the person that you lost isn't in pain anymore, or they wouldn't want you to be unhappy. These phrases can feel very well-meaning, but they can miss the mark and feel really insensitive at the same time. And there are little responses that you might actually have come up for you to each of those. It could be something like, maybe they're not in pain anymore, or maybe you feel that they're in a better place, but I actually think the best place would be here with me, or something like everything happens for a reason. It's very hard to find a reason that this would happen to you, or to feel like a higher power is punishing you by taking somebody away. So I think the real nuanced caveat here is knowing what somebody else's beliefs are and not imposing your own. So if you know that somebody is aligned with you in those ways and share similar beliefs, those statements might be perfectly fine and they might really appreciate hearing them. But if not, it can really feel like kind of an imposition and feel really insensitive. When you're talking to somebody who's going through grief, what can we say that will actually work for them if we don't know their beliefs? Because that would be a really close relationship where we would really understand what they're going through. But there are times when we're not going to, or somebody might have gone through the loss and then feel like, fuck everything I used to say. I have a completely different belief now, like fuck God, fuck everything, right? So what do you say to this person? I think that the best thing is for it to be whatever is authentic, because I think that those platitudes are something that we tend to lean on instead of being authentic. We're not really saying what we're actually feeling and thinking, which could be so good. As simple as, I'm so sorry, or I'm so upset that this is happening to you, or something as simple as this, again, would be if you were close, I'm so sorry this is happening, I love you. Or saying, I don't know that there are any words that would actually do any of this justice. That would be so much more true than sort of like a phrase that you've heard and seen a lot and you think you're supposed to say to somebody. Totally. I love all those. And also, I think sometimes the reason we say those is because we get uncomfortable that somebody else is grieving in our presence, because maybe we have ungrieved grief. And so to see somebody else doing it brings it up for us. And we might not even be present to our feelings. We might just be like, oh, bad, shove it down. I'm going to say something to make this person feel better, which is going to make me feel better. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that when somebody is going through a loss, especially if they're sharing about it, that can definitely trigger some unprocessed grief wounds in other people that they just haven't explored yet. And even if they haven't had that experience, I think there is a fear of saying something that will upset the grieving person even more. So sometimes, I talk a lot about the idea of bringing up the person who died to the person who's grieving, especially if you've gotten an indication that they would like to talk about them, even if you sort of like flat out ask if they're okay with talking about them or if that's something they'd like to do. I think there is a fear that if I bring up this person, if I even bring up the loss, I'm reminding them that it happened. There's no way that you can remind somebody. It's always there, even if it's kind of in the back of our minds, even if it sinks into the background, it's always somewhat present. So I think so much of it is fear of what are we going to feel? What are we going to make them feel? And I think it could be avoided by just really open communication. What's a way to bring that conversation in? How can you create space for somebody
in a way that's really meaningful?
I think being a good listener, noticing if your friend brings up somebody who died, even if it's just a sort of like a brief comment, like a very passing comment, not letting it drop. Don't just move on to the next thing. Be on the lookout for that. Notice if they bring them up and then see if they'd like to add on to it. If you knew the person who died, you could say, I have memories about this person I'd love to share with you if you'd be open to it, or I'd love to hear some of your memories, or even just reflecting to them, I noticed that you brought that person up. I don't think I've ever heard you do that before. Just not letting it drop.
I love that. I've talked to people who they've gone through a massive loss, and maybe I hear this particularly around losses that have other elements, such as their loved one has been murdered, their loved one died of addiction, suicide, and they feel like a pariah. They feel like nobody wants to talk to them about it. And whenever they try to talk about it, they get shut down, or people are like, can you kind of move on? Other than therapy, like how can they actually bring into their social world this conversation? Do they need to find totally new friends? How do you actually go through this? Because it's a real problem for people who are going through it.
Yeah, and I really feel for those people who don't have at least one close person in their lives already that they feel like they can talk about it with. I think something that you're getting at is the concept of disenfranchised grief. I tend to think that most grief is disenfranchised in the way that we don't talk about it. But there are certainly, different kinds of grief. Like you were talking about grief around abortion. That's definitely a form of disenfranchised grief that is especially taboo and not discussed enough. I do think that people seem to really flock toward groups of people who have shared experience, who really get it. And fortunately, there are so many out there. I mean, just online, even during the pandemic, I think a lot of different groups were going on, and people do seem to gravitate towards ones that are very specific to their exact type of loss, especially if it was something like addiction, suicide, homicide. Sure.
Yeah. So somebody can just basically Google groups. One of the positive outcomes of the pandemic is this global community that's sprung up for so many different people where they haven't had access to something before, now have access. What hope can you give to people who are experiencing loss and grief right now?
It won't always feel exactly like it does at this moment. So as much as I tend to put the message out there that grief has no time limit and grief might always stay with you in some way, that does not mean that it will be stagnant, that it'll always feel like it does right now. I think that life can get so much better after. And at the same time, you will keep things with you that you've learned because of this. And even though you would trade anything to have your person back, I think at the same time, you'll feel glad that you know yourself in a different way. You have a new, strong sense of identity and values. But yeah, most importantly, that it won't always feel exactly like it does right now.
So true. Thank you so much, Alex. This has been amazing. You're amazing. And I just really appreciate your work. You're changing the world, and I cannot thank you enough.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was another episode of Big Energy with me, your host, Cassie Underwood. Were you into it? Go ahead and click the subscribe button and leave a review. You can also find me online at cassieunderwood.com. See you next time. And remember, Money Metaphysics for Maverick Women, my 6-month program, is open for enrollment. Learn more and register at cassieunderwood.com/MMMW.